everybody. Thanks for coming. As you know, we released JSS last October with Symposium. And since then, we've been busy adding a few new features, kind of patching things up a little bit here and there. And today we'll give you a sneak preview into what's next. Who here has not heard of JSS? All right.
Only Richard Seal. That's
perfect. So we can skip this slide. Basically, it's a toolkit for allowing you to build modern JavaScript solutions with Sitecore without any compromises. That's great. It's becoming more and more popular, obviously, hitting 2,800 downloads a week on NPM. And we just hit 100 GitHub stars, which is cool. And at this time, we just want to say thanks to all of the community members for their active contributions, everybody that's been involved in Slack, all the feedback. It's what is making JSS popular, with what keeps us going and adding all these fun new features for everybody. So we'd like to give you a round
if
of
anybody
applause.
in here has contributed to JSS, like opened an issue, talked with us on Slack, done a pull request, stand up.
Yeah.
Come on.
Come on.
Nick, get up.
You're all here. You're all here. Nice.
Thank you so much for your support.
Yes. Oh, and yeah, we're kind of a big deal now. Anyways, also, just one of the things that makes JSS really popular is that it takes 5 minutes to set up. 4 CLI commands, and you're pretty much done. Unless
You don't need a Sitecore instance.
Unless
All you need is Node, that's it. But if you're on a slow connection, try this trick to speed up your download. If that doesn't work, download more RAM.
All right. Enough of the fun jokes. Moving on to what's coming next.
Yep. So people wanted to know what's next in JSS. And we've been listening to the most popular things that people have been asking for. And by far, one of the most popular is, can I use SXA with JSS? And the answer is, today, you can mostly use SXA with JSS. There's a couple of issues, so we don't actually recommend it, but it mostly works. But today, let me show you how it does work. So in SXA, coming out in the next major release of Sitecore, we're going to deliver SXA site management for JSS apps inside of a special JSS tenant. And that means that you're going to get SXA media handling, you're going to get SXA placeholder setting handling, and you'll be able to do the same JSS import process that you're already doing with a JSS disconnected app, except you can import it directly into a SXA site instead. Next, we're bringing page and partial design support. So you'll be able to use the page and partial design feature from SXA to be able to share personalized layouts across your site. So if you want to, say, have a footer on every single page, or every page that uses a partial design that has personalization rules on it, things like that, and you have SXA, you can do that with JSS. And there is nothing special that the JavaScript app has to do to consume a partial design at all. It is just integrated into the JSON that comes out of the layout service. So any existing JavaScript app could be deployed onto SXA with this and immediately start taking advantage of partial designs, which we'll show you in a sec. But it is important to know that some parts of SXA don't make sense when you're talking about a headless tool like JSS. So it retains JSS architecture, it works like JSS does today, and that means that you should not expect headed CMS features of SXA, like the component library, the toolbox experience editor, and creative exchange and theming, because, what's the point of theming if you're headless, right? And you won't be able to do natively the SXA partial design stuff in disconnected mode, although you could sort of fake it by defining the layout yourself, because it's a very complex feature that is part of SXA. But you can use all the stuff that you can do in JSS today inside of SXA. And with that, let's go play. Could you swap it over to the demo, please? Thanks. Yep. So this is a pre-release version of Sitecore that is running a pre-release version of SXA. And if I go to the content node here, you can see that we have a new tenant type called JSS tenant. So we can create one of these, and it works just like creating any old other tenant. And it runs the same type of scripts. And I should note, is Adam Naimanovich in here? Hands up if you are. Okay, he apparently went and hid, but all of the SXA features that have been done have been part of from the SXA team, so we actually didn't have anything to do with it, so big thanks to that team for making all this stuff. I'm just showing it to you. So we created a new tenant, and just like an SXA tenant, that also stubs out the like the renderings folders and the other things you'd expect to come with the tenant. And we can make a JSS site. It's worth noting that JSS tenants can only contain JSS sites, so you can't create a tenant and then mix an SXA tenant site as well as a JSS tenant site in the same tenant, if that hopefully makes sense. So we'll create a new site in here, and it looks like creating an SXA site, but if we go under site settings, we've got JSS specific settings. So just like if you were deploying a JSS site with the regular deployment tools where you deploy a configuration patch to set the site definition, and you'd set the secret to use to deploy items to the site from disconnected mode. In this case, you set it in the site setting. So I've already configured a secret on this, but I have not deployed any configuration files to the Sitecore instance at all. So all of the Sitecore instance is completely vanilla SXA. There's nothing deployed here. So we'll set the secret, and we'll have it create the new site. So it goes through and it does a bunch of creation of templates and wiring things up. Essentially the same thing as you would get if you imported an empty JSS site. So if you wanted to do JSS using the Sitecore first workflow, where instead of defining things in the JSS app and importing them, you want to create the items directly in Sitecore, you get all of that working SXA-like. So this is a good way to scaffold that out. So as you can see under here, we get a whole bunch of settings. And the next thing that we have to do to get this working is to deploy this site. So what I did is I created a rather silly site in JSS called the Sitecore Monty Python Fan Club, where I had fun with memes. And this is running disconnected from Sitecore using local YAML content in disconnected mode, which means that it has absolutely no connection to Sitecore. It's running out of this window here, this terminal window in VS Code. So if I do JSS deploy app, and we want to include content, we want to include the dictionary and make it do stuff, what it's going to do is it's going to connect to Sitecore, deploy the items, and deploy the JavaScript necessary to run it. But unlike a traditional JSS site, we don't actually have to deploy any configuration to Sitecore, so we don't have to recycle the app pool because it's using SXA's site infrastructure. So if we take a look at this settings item that SXA created, and we look at some of the fields, there's a lot of the import settings that you would see in a JSS app here. So you can specify like where your JavaScript bundle is, default languages, databases, paths, if you want to customize that. And also that's where you specify things like the server-side rendering settings and stuff like that. And by now, it has done deployed. So if we go here, where right now this is Sitecore Betty, and we refresh it, we get the Sitecore Monty Python Fan Club. So all of this stuff was imported into SXA, and if we load Experience Editor, you can see that this is a fully experience editable site with a section and renderings with items inside of it, and you can do all the signature things you could do with it. But this is an SXA site, and we want to take advantage of SXA features. One thing we have in this site is we've got a prototype future enhancement in the footer that we'll get into in the next demo. And we've got a copyright message. And what we want to do is to make that available everywhere. So like if I look at this other route in the site, that's a success page, it doesn't have a footer, right? It doesn't have anything on it. We don't want to have to create and add the copyright message onto every single page. We just want to do it once, maintain it once. You know, suppose we need to personalize it for visitors from the EU to add a cookie message or something, we could do that. So what we want to do is use SXA's partial design feature. The first step to doing that is let's get rid of this, because we're going to share it from the partial design. So now there's no footer anywhere. So on the presentation here, we need to create a partial design. Who here does not know what a partial design is? Everybody knows what a partial design is. This is an awesome audience. I don't think I believe you. But after seeing this, hopefully you'll understand what a partial design is capable of, because we're going to use this partial design. So we're going to create this design called footer, and essentially what this design does is it lets us create a layout that we can then pull as a partial layout into other items. So this looks like a page, right, and it has no items on it. So what we're going to do is we're going to go add stuff to the footer. So we'll add a content block. And I intentionally did not put the content block in a place where you could use it, right? So we've got 2 data source places, but we can't choose the item we imported. What we need to do is look under the home item that we imported, where it will have a bunch of local data source items here in page data. And you've got copyright notice. So this contains the text that we want, but what we want to do is move it to the place where we would store shared items. So under the data folder here, we've got site level shared data, so we'll throw it under content block here. And now, if we go back here, we should be able to choose the item. Copyright notice. And while we're at it, I will throw in, for the next demo, a form, which right now just says prototype feature enhancement. So this is now a partial design that we've created a segment of the layout on. And if we go back to the desktop, to use a partial design, you need a page design to put it on. And by default, when you import the JSS app, it does not use page designs because they're an SXA feature. But we can quickly make it do that by creating one. And what you do in the page designs is you add partial designs to them. So you can think of it as like mixing your partial layouts together into getting a full page layout that you can then customize the bits that are left. So if we save that and we go to refresh this page, the last thing we have to do is tell this page to use the page design, and we're going to do that by telling it to map the app route template, which is every page that we imported basically uses the app route template right now, and we'll map it to the SUGCON page design. So we'll save this, and when we're done, you can see we've got the success of having our copyright message in the footer, and similarly, if we go to the success page, we've got it here too. So we added shared layout in a headless site across all of our pages using SXA partial designs. Could you flip it back to the slides, please? So next, who loves forms? Anybody love forms? Okay, you're crazy. Forms are not really that exciting. But people have to use forms because forms are a very popular thing to have on websites, and they're very useful at gathering information. So a big thing that people asked for in addition to SXA was to have support for Sitecore Forms in JSS apps. So similarly to SXA, we've delivered that in this case. Bringing them into a headless CMS is a bit of a challenge because Sitecore Forms has multiple step support and complex validations and all sorts of other stuff. But we've come up with something that supports most of those features. So we support JSS multi-step forms with Sitecore Forms, and they work pretty much exactly the same way that they would in MVC, except that they are post-backless, essentially. We implemented it fully client-side. You will not see any rendered HTML from the server getting pulled to the client and dumped on the page here. It is fully JSON-based, data-driven. Everything is running in React and works pretty much like a React app should work. And finally, let's go play with it. Can you switch back, please? So we added in the page design in the last step something that said prototype feature enhancement. And if I click on it, the prototype feature enhancement is that we want to add a contact form to the footer of our site on every page because we want to gather leads or something like that. And the way that we do that is by adding a form. And what I did to create this form was I scaffolded a JSS component. So I just typed JSS scaffold form at the command line, and it created this component. And then I built this prototype form in React that we can get rid of that basically is that HTML prototype that we just looked at. So the first thing I'm going to do is get rid of this prototype form. Sorry, touchpads are harder than they look. So I will start this deploying. So I'm going to tell it to basically build this form after we updated it and deploy it so we get something that works. And in the meantime, you'll see, if you know anything about React, that what we've done is we've imported a new Sitecore JSS React Forms library. And what this does is it gives us a component called form that we are using here that we're binding the same way that we would bind other JSS helper components. We're passing it the fields prop, which is where you get the fields on your item. And we're telling it where it needs to post the form. So we're giving it the API host, the API key. This on redirect here is patching it so that instead of using window.location and causing a page refresh, if somebody has a redirect submit action, it instead uses client-side routing for it so that it doesn't do a page refresh. It's a special hook here because you might not be using React Router, you might be using Reach Router or something else, so we want to let you pick that. And we're putting a component around every single field. So there's a bunch of customized options that you can put on here. And that should be visible here. So if this all has TypeScript typing, so you can look at all the various things that you can put on here. So like you can pass a custom error component, you can override the label, you can override the fetcher if you want to do something with a different HTTP library. And those are all documented with comments in the typings that we export. So now we've taken the form, we've made just the simple form component, and this is part of the documentation. Yes, there's documentation when this releases. And we've deployed it up to Sitecore. So if we refresh this page now, you'll see that the form is not working, right? Because it says, handily, no form data was provided. Well, when we brought the component in, it didn't have a data source because it didn't need one, it was a form. So what we need to do is configure that component. So we go under Layout, Renderings, Project, Tenant, and grab Form. So just like any other JSS imported item, it gets imported protected by default. So we have to unprotect it so that we can do stuff. And then just like any data sourced component, we need to set a data source template. Actually, I'll skip that for this point because we don't actually need it. And I'll set the data source location to the forms root. So I'll save that, and we'll see what happened. And it still didn't work because we didn't set a data source. So now we need to set one. And we need to do it in the partial design because it's not editable outside the partial design. So what we need to do is add associated content, and we'll just choose our pre-built form, save it. And now, if you look closely, it still isn't working, but it's telling us why it's not working. It says form data invalid. Did you forget to set the rendering contents resolver? So to understand what that means, let me pull up the layout service output for this page. So the layout service gives you the layout as JSON, and you can see what we've got here is we've got a full placeholder called SUGCON footer, and inside we've got the form component, and it's got fields. But the fields are basically serializing the fields only of the form item itself. So we don't have any field data, we don't have any validation data, we just have the data about the form root item. And that's not useful. Like, we need to know what the steps are and what the field types are and what the fields are we need to submit and things like that. So what JSS gives you is a feature called rendering contents resolvers, which if we scroll further down, that let you take that fields collection that we just looked at and change the way that it renders. So if you choose the new Sitecore Forms resolver and save it, and we go take a look at our JSON, instead of having that item just serialized, instead we've got all of the session IDs and item IDs and anti-forgery tokens and metadata and all the stuff that we need, including the fields and everything to render the form. So that basically patches in the logic you need to get the form data. And then, if we refresh this page, now that we have the correct data, you can see that we've got a form. And if you're a fan of Monty Python and the Holy Grail like I am, you'll probably recognize this form. And it is defined just like any other Sitecore form. It has got 2 steps. You can see that it has fields here. There's absolutely no customizations to this form editor at all. I just built a pretty simple form. And with that, why don't we fill it out? So if I go into preview mode here, and say we'll be Sir Lancelot, if I could type. And we seek the holy GDPR. So if we go to the next step, you can see on the form designer itself, on the next step, there's multiple fields. And this is where that component wrapper on the field that I put in here, the field wrapper component comes in. There's 3 fields on the second step. But what I'm doing is I'm wrapping each field with some JavaScript that I won't get into that basically dynamically chooses whether it should show these fields on the second one. So because we entered Sir Lancelot, it's only asking us what's your favorite color. So if we say blue and submit it, it fails. Why does it fail? Because in the form designer, on the submit action, it has a redirect to page, but the redirect to page was set before I imported the JSS app, so it's not valid anymore, and I have to fix that. So we'll find our success page here, pick it, save it, and without needing to reload because it's already saved, we can submit it and it works. You got the thank you page. So if we go back to the home page now, and we do something different, like say be Sir Robin, and Sir Robin doesn't know what his quest is, but we don't have any logic in there for that. It's just for fun. But it does ask him what is the capital of Assyria. Anyone know what the capital of Assyria is? Okay, I do. And we can go back, for example, and say we are King Arthur instead. And you will note that there is validation here, including on the server side. If I submitted this, it will, if I show you in DevTools here, when I post this, it's posting off to the form builder. Hopefully that's big enough that you can see it. But essentially what you're getting back, it's posting JSON to the server of the current form state. And what it's getting back is the next form state. And the next form state in the schema can have validation errors embedded into it. So the what is your email as required message is actually server-side validation executed back to the client using the JSON data. So all of the validations that you can do with Sitecore Forms continue to work exactly the same way as they would otherwise, including, for example, I'm pretty sure that has an email format validator on it. It has it at this client server. So if I go there, now it does not like that there's an exclamation mark in the email address because the Sitecore Forms validator won't allow an exclamation mark in the email address. And that was server-side email format validation. So if we go next, for King Arthur, it will ask radio button list. So we support all the field types that Sitecore Forms supports. Radio button list, drop downs, you can do dynamic field sources. So basically everything that Sitecore Forms can do. And then we'll just choose African or European so that we can get across the bridge of death, submit it, and we got a success page. And we can prove that we actually got form data by going back here, grabbing our form and exporting it to CSV. And if we take a look at it, you can see that we have 2 submits. We got from Arthur and Lancelot, and we have all of the values here. So that, in a nutshell, is Sitecore JSS Forms. At release, anyway, there's only a library in JSS and JavaScript for React, but it is split into 2 libraries. One is generic forms support, and one is React forms support. So it should be pretty easy if somebody wants to do forms in other languages. But we chose React because React is by far the most popular language people are choosing in JSS so far. And that's what I had. So if you could switch back to the presentation.
So the last thing we want to show and talk about is another new feature called JSS Rendering Host. And what this is going to allow you to do is basically render your JSS app outside of a internally running or Sitecore managed node instance. So just a quick refresher on how the JSS integrated rendering engine works. A request comes in through the standard MVC handlers, ships it off to layout service to build up that JSON representation of your item, and then that layout service data and some context data is handed off to a rendering engine interface, right? And the rendering engine then is responsible for doing something with that data and returning HTML back to Sitecore, which delivers it out to the browser. So how does that work with Node.js in the picture? Currently, with JSS and integrated rendering, Sitecore, we have some code that basically spins up and manages Node.js instances for you. So we have pooling and things like that all kind of happen behind the scenes. We create the node instance and then we tear it down when it's not needed anymore. Things like that. So that's how it works, and some of the advantages of that are you don't need to, or that you only need to install Node on the Sitecore server, right? And you're just done. It's just kind of plug and play, it works. You don't have to really worry about, setting up Node and configuring it. You don't have to explicitly start and stop your node instances, worry about how they're managed. All of that's handled in the render engine code. And then we also have some built-in pooling options as well. But some of the difficulties coming from that are that you can't control the startup of those instances explicitly. So you can't attach a profiler very easily. It's a little harder to do debugging that way. It's possible, but hard. And you have limited control over how your instances are pooled or clustered. Some DevOps and IT teams don't really want Node on their Sitecore servers or part of that infrastructure, so there's complaints there. And lastly, you have to deploy all of your JSS build artifacts, like files, static assets, things like that, have to get deployed to the Sitecore server. So with JSS Rendering Host, we're hoping to kind of alleviate some of those things. The idea here is that if I go, sorry, I missed a couple things, or I missed one big point on here. So when this local node instance gets spun up by Sitecore, it's basically a web server. It's just a little mini web server sitting on top of Node that takes in layout service data, and we make a little, an RPC call with layout service and context data. That Node server does the rendering and then sends HTML back. So if we skip back forward, what if we took that same Node.js web server and moved it somewhere else, right? It doesn't have to be, what if we didn't spin it up in Sitecore? What would that give us? So in this scenario, you wouldn't actually need to host Sitecore Node on your Sitecore instance. You can have full control over how it starts up, how you manage it, clustering, pooling, profiling, debugging, all of that can be managed outside of Sitecore, and you would have explicit control over it. You can group that node instance along with, perhaps the rest of your front-end rendering instances for, the JSS proxy or wherever your node instances are living for all of your front-end delivery. And lastly, we don't need to deploy any JSS files to the Sitecore server in this scenario. They can be deployed directly to wherever that node rendering instance is living. Some of the issues with this approach are that you have to make sure that that rendering instance is actually awake and that Sitecore can communicate with it. Typically not a problem, but if it goes down, you can't, you're not going to see anything in integrated mode with Sitecore. Your content editors can't edit or anything like that. And it potentially makes things a little more complicated in terms of infrastructure and if you don't have node expertise on your team. So.
But you do only have to deploy the JavaScript artifacts to one place, right?
Exactly. All right, can we switch to demo? So let's see it in action. We gotta switch. There. Okay. So we saw Kam do the SXA deployment before, so I won't go through that, or just the SXA JSS tenant. But what I've done here is basically what Kam showed before. We deployed a JSS React demo to a JSS tenant. But one of the key things I want to show here is in the settings.
He's got a newer version than I had.
Yeah. There's a couple new fields in this one. And we'll see we have the server-side rendering engine and the server-side rendering engine endpoint URL for long field names. Currently, by default, it's Node.js, meaning that Sitecore would manage the locally running instance, right? But if we change that to HTTP, which is what we're calling it internally, and then actually provide an endpoint, and I'll do this. This is a known endpoint for us. If I could actually type. I can't type, sorry. There, I think that's right. And we'll save it. So what this is telling Sitecore to do is to start using this remote endpoint to do its rendering. And so because we're using this JSS tenant, we didn't actually have to deploy a config file to Sitecore, which is huge for anybody that's been doing development against remote Sitecore instances with JSS, right? You always have to do that JSS deploy config before you can get started working with Sitecore. So if we save that and we go try to visit the site, nothing should come up, 404, because it can't find that remote instance. So let's go ahead and spin that up. This is my JSS sample app, and we've added a couple new commands. The first one we're going to show is JSS start rendering host. Come on. So what this is going to do is spin up that little web server that I mentioned before, right? So it's going to actually create a small web server based on Webpack that's listening at this URL, jss.ngrok.io. And the reason we're using ngrok, for anybody that's not familiar with ngrok, it's a tunneling software that allows you to basically expose your local machine to a public internet URL. So this is just to kind of show how you could work with a remote Sitecore instance kind of tunneling back to your local instance. Would
you always need that?
No. You could easily run the Sitecore machine on your side-by-side if you're actually doing that kind of development. But anyways, we're tunneling, we're running the host, and now if we go back to Sitecore and actually refresh the page, you can see that we now have rendering. So if we look at the console output here, you can see it says started rendering host, and we're rendering the app via this bundle. So that's pretty cool. And if you can see we can obviously still get all the experience editor stuff here. One of the other cool things that we've added here is this, you might notice this little query string parameter at the top, if we can actually see it. This would allow individual developers or individual requests to Sitecore to specify its own rendering URL. So let's say you have multiple developers working against a remote instance of Sitecore. Each one of them could have their own tunnel, potentially, pointing to a different rendering instance. That way there's no, conflicting over previews and stuff like that. So,
and that's on a per session basis, right?
Exactly. And so another key point here to remember is that we haven't deployed any files to Sitecore right now. No JSS artifacts, no config deployment, nothing like that. So you can imagine this web server that I spun up sitting somewhere else, in your infrastructure somewhere, and all it's doing is rendering. When you deploy your files or build your artifacts, you deploy it to that node instance.
You could basically just go on Azure and go to the marketplace, spin up Sitecore, check off JSS, check off SXA.
Done.
Once this is released, of course,
right.
It's not out there yet. But when you're done, you could have something you could deploy JSS sites to without touching the files at all by just provisioning from Marketplace.
Right.
That's it.
So one of the other cool things that this opens up is the ability to, with this ngrok tunnel, we'll go ahead. Another command, we have yet to name what this command is actually going to be, but for now we're using Holy Grail. So what it's going to do in the background is, along with spinning up a rendering host, it's spinning up what's called a Webpack dev server. So it's Webpack in the background, but a local development server that is going to basically live and act as an actual web server. So as a local developer, I would spin this up, build my bundles, and it's going to launch our site that we kind of saw before, right? So nothing crazy here except for the fact that I'm a local developer now running this. I don't have to, again, deploy any files to Sitecore. do any of that thing. I can be on my Mac. I can work against a remote instance of Sitecore. I haven't had to touch Sitecore at all other than to specify what URL to render in. And with Webpack Dev Server, what it does is it opens up this, if you can see these socket consoles coming up, it basically injects a little JavaScript into your app that it loads and allows us to do things like hot module replacement and live reloading. So as I'm making changes to my code locally, if I go ahead and save it, it'll recompile the bundle, and it should just automatically refresh this page that it's listed. You can see it already starting to refresh by itself. I didn't touch anything, and there we go. We've got some new content that I added below the question, and then again, this helps developers start previewing what they can do in Experience Editor, right? So for those cases where you have to do render fields a little bit differently in Experience Editor, we've got this extra content here. We're doing, if it's page editing, we're adding this extra content, and when it's not, if I go ahead and go incognito, we'll see that the render thing has been removed. And this instance, this page is also listening to those Webpack Dev Server changes. So you could have these two windows open side by side, see changes live reloading as you're developing and saving and recompiling. So
it's a good reason to have 3 monitors, right?
Exactly.
Preview, editor, code.
So we're hoping that really opens up a new way of developing for developers that really don't want anything to do with Sitecore, and it maybe helps with your infrastructure plans as well. Maybe one remote instance can serve multiple JavaScript developers, right? And they don't have to really, their only interaction with Sitecore is no longer deploying files, it's saving locally, previewing locally, getting everything done locally, right? And then commit when they're done. And I think that was it. Can we go back to slides, please? So everything we've talked about here today will be shipping in the next release of Sitecore. Don't have an exact date, so we're not the ones to be able to answer that question, but soon, hopefully.
You can see it works, right?
Yeah, it all works. It's magic. And you can find us on Slack and Twitter. We're on Slack regularly, answering questions if you have any. Happy to be there. And again, thank you, everyone, for all of your contributions. Much appreciated.
Looks like we've got a few minutes for questions.
Yeah.
So if you have questions, grab the mic. Thanks.
Any questions? Oh, no, not him. When you were doing the Forms demo, you said SXA plus Forms plus JSS. Is SXA required, or can you have Forms and JSS without SXA?
You can have Forms with JSS without SXA. It was just demoed with SXA in this case to show all the technologies at the same time.
When you have that HTTP rendering engine for Node.js, is the rendering engine that is local also running, or can you disable it to not have to install Node.js at all on your Sitecore server?
Yeah, in this case, we're not using Node there in any way, so it doesn't have to be on your Sitecore server.
Okay. Could we have a fallback if the server is not responding, then use the local?
Yeah, that can be done. That's not built in, but it should be pretty easy.
Good.
And we'll consider adding it. So right now, it's a simple factory based on that, whatever you define there.
Yeah, I think in most cases, if you're looking to use external rendering, you'd probably always want to use it. And the reason why is because if you're doing a DevOps process, it means that your node deployment process can be completely decoupled from Sitecore changes. So you don't have to orchestrate deployment of exactly the same JavaScript built twice to your Sitecore server and to your node host.
Right.
You could just deploy it to your node host.
When you make a custom validation in the Sitecore Forms or a custom field, how do it work in JSS?
If you're doing a custom validation, then the custom validation executes on the post back to the server, and it will return the same error reply that it would otherwise, and then we'll show it on JSS the same way it would as if it was an MVC, because all the custom validations happen on the server.
You don't have to modify something in the JavaScript files.
No.
Oh, sounds cool.
Well, if you want client-side validation.
Yeah, if you want client-side validation that's not on submit, you'd have to modify the field rendering bit. And you could do that in most cases because the field metadata is provided to the renderer. I didn't show it, but the way that the fields types works is there's essentially, just like in how in JSS you've got a mapping between a string that's a component name and a component that implements it, there's the exact same thing under the forms. So there's a field component factory that maps, a field ID of the text field in Sitecore Forms into a React component that renders the text field on the client. So if you wanted to do some custom client-side validation or something, you would just patch that component factory so that it returned a custom React component that you did that did whatever custom validation you wanted for that particular field type, or in the case of it being a particular field ID or something like that.
When you mapped the page design to the template, you mentioned there is only one template for imported pages. Does it mean that you can only have one page design for the entire site?
No, it doesn't. The sample app that we build just has one route template, but you can define multiple route templates in JSS disconnected mode. You could also, if you're doing Sitecore first, you can make as many route template types as you want. It's just this particular application that's a modified sample app just has one route type. Okay.
One last question. Where is the beer? No beer. Thank you very much, gentlemen.
Yeah.
It was
Thanks
a
for having
pleasure
us.
having you.